this is your first morning with us, you're joining us right smack dab in the middle of a series that we've entitled The Transformation Trajectory. It's like there's this question that looms if your experience is deconstructing and reconstructing your faith, if it's transitioning from one community of faith into maybe this community of faith or any community of faith for that matter, or maybe you're just re-engaging some sense of spirituality or religion at this stage of your life. There's this question that often goes something like this: what's the new place that I'm supposed to stand? I was handed all these things growing up, certain beliefs, certain practices, certain ways of like being church or going to church or being spiritual. And some of those don't work anymore for me, or I'm not sure what to do with those ideas, and I'm looking for something different. And so we've been surmising these 8 different progressive planes of faith that might be helpful for you to at least experience or move towards in terms of what your faith journey could look like. And so we've talked about the progressive plane of liberation, the idea that until you become free of certain things, it might be difficult for you to help others experience freedom. Free people. We talked about how our view of God and life and the world around us and the scriptures and everything in between should always be evolving. There's an evolutionary process to this journey. We talked about the idea of awareness and how you can't really change something that you don't see. You have to be able to see something about yourself in order to really institute some sort of different behavior, new type of activism, a maturity of sorts that surfaces out of a place of epiphany or awareness. And then we talked about also, in the forward motion of our faith, as we progress, as we become aware and become more liberated, more evolutionary of sorts, that one thing that can't happen is that our generosity take a step backwards. Like we have to figure out what it means to become more generous towards a world that could really benefit from some of the gifts or some of the wealth or the affluence that so many of us are privileged with. And so last weekend we started talking about the progressive plane of solidarity. I want to revisit a little bit of the conversation from last week. So if you were here last weekend, this will be a little bit of a review for you. If you weren't, then maybe this will kind of dial you in to where or how the conversation was left when we closed out last Sunday. But there's a connection to last weekend and to this weekend, and I think that'll be really clear in just a moment. Last weekend we started by looking at a passage in Luke's gospel that described a conversation between Jesus and someone called the rich young ruler. This young ruler, it's understood to have, this guy was understood to have been a part of something called the Sanhedrin, which was like the top sort of governing authority within Israel when it was under rule of Caesar and Herod and the powers that be in Jesus' day. And this rich young ruler came to Jesus and he said, listen, I want eternal life. I want the most dynamic, the most wide open, best life there is to live. A life of the ages is how it's sometimes described. And Jesus said, well, have you kept this commandment or that commandment? And the guy says, listen, I've been doing it all since I was a child. And Jesus, he says to this gentleman, he says, oh, okay, well, if that's the case, then you lack one thing. Sell everything you have, give the money to the poor, and then you'll have treasures in heaven. And then he says, come follow me. And the guy, when he heard this, he was very sad because he was very wealthy. If you were here last Sunday, you heard me talk about this. But then you also heard me step out of this passage and talk about the experience that my wife had when she was a teenager attending a high school party. One of those parties where everybody kind of stands around doing some underage drinking and drinking from a red Solo cup. Nobody knows what I'm talking about. If you need more information about that, see me afterwards. But she describes arriving at this party. Everyone's kind of standing around doing this. And she makes her way up to the edge of a swimming pool. There was a pool at the house where this was happening. And some guy comes along and sort of shoves her in the back. She falls into the pool. It's teenage antics at its best. Everybody's laughing, even some of the girls. But we started to notice that in this party, and again, it was 20, 25 years ago, We notice how the guys seem perfectly comfortable at this party, sort of continuing to hold their red cups, and without any sort of fear of being thrown in. They knew they weren't going to be targeted, while simultaneously benefiting from the power dynamics. It said, it's perfectly okay for us guys, the group with the power and the privilege at this party, to be entertained at the expense of the girls who apparently had less power and less privilege, or else they wouldn't have been the only ones being thrown in. But then the morning started to really take a turn when we wondered aloud, like, what could a boy have done if he had been awake enough in that moment to notice not only the injustice of the girls being thrown into the pool, but like maybe even start to do something about this. And one of the things that we said was, well, this boy could have moved towards solidarity with the girls. He could have put down his red Solo cup, and he could have literally jumped in the pool himself. We named what solidarity was through that metaphor. We said solidarity is when you stand with those who are in need of or in pursuit of justice or peace for themselves or the world. We said that the way that you move towards solidarity, according to what we're told by the people who sort of live in the pool, we're told that we move towards solidarity when we acknowledge our power and our privilege, when we become honest about our complicity. In other words, we acknowledge there are systems that fuel our privilege and our power for those of us who sit on the outside with the cup. And this happens at the expense of the people in the pool. We move towards solidarity when we own our own conversion process, when we realize that it's not the people in the pool that we should be trying to change, it's the people outside of the pool, namely ourselves. We should be taking ownership in how our transformation or conversion process is to play out. And all this to say that when Jesus meets this rich young ruler where he was in his life, and he says, sell your possessions, give them to the poor, essentially he's saying, listen, put down your red Solo cup and get into the pool. Move towards solidarity with the poor. Become poor. Begin to stand with those who are most victimized, those who are most marginalized by what you do and who you are as a member of the High Council, the Sanhedrin. And so that's as far as we got last Sunday, which was a long way for the record. But this morning, I want to keep moving forward from that conversation, or actually within that conversation, and I want to get to the next progressive plane, but it's going to require that we pick up where we left off just a little bit in the conversation between Jesus and this person. And so Jesus tells the rich young ruler, sell all your possessions, give the money to the poor, and then you'll have treasures in heaven. And then he says, then come and follow me. And what does this really mean? Come, follow me. When Jesus says this, is he talking about a place of greater moral superiority? Is he talking about heaven after you die? I mean, what is he really saying when he says, come follow me? Which, for the record, for 2,000 years, that's been the million-dollar question, right? Wars have been fought over how people answer this question. What does it mean for Jesus, or what does it mean for us to adhere to his request, come follow me? I think it was about 2 years into our experience here at Watershed, and our staff, which at that time was just Scott and I think, our staff, maybe there's a couple other folks, read this book called The Holy Longing by Richard Rollheiser, Guidelines for Christian Spirituality. And within this book, there was this really interesting parable where Rollheiser describes this village that exists on the banks of this really massive, healthy river. And this river is really important for the village, the people who live in this village on the side of the river. It's where they fish. It's where they pull in clean water. It's where they bathe, wash their clothes, whatnot. So the river is really important. And they've been living there for a long time as a group of tribesmen and tribeswomen. And then one day, they're just kind of minding their own business, and somebody notices that this person is floating down the river that they've never seen before. And this person, they seem to be struggling. And so one of the men jump in the water, and they swim out, and they pull this person back to the shoreline, and this person is wounded. He's barely alive. He looks like he hasn't eaten, and so they pull him in, and all the village comes together, and they bandage his wounds, and they start to nurse him back to health, and they give him something to eat and provide him a place that's safe to heal. And so that's like day one, and then the next day, they're out doing their village sort of business, and somebody notices several people floating down the river this time. And so they mobilize themselves. They go in, they grab the people who are in the water, they pull them out. Same thing, they're wounded, they're all beaten up. They give them water, they give them food, they bandage their wounds. They begin to, again, nurture them back to health. This time, not everyone survives. And so they have to literally bury some of the people that they're trying to rescue. And so this happens again the next day, and then again the next day, and week after week after week. People are floating down the river, wounded, dead or near dead. And the village begins doing this really powerful work of pulling people out of the water, bandaging their wounds, meeting their needs, creating safe spaces so that they can become well, burying the dead, giving them dignity. Maybe they even provide grief counseling. Who knows, right? But the amount of fulfillment that they experience in this is off the page. It's so fulfilling to know that, like, every day the work that you do rescues someone. And it actually extends the life of a person. In fact, they even begin to express gratitude for where they live on the river. God, can you imagine if we didn't live here? We had all the stuff that people need as they're floating down so that we can kind of help them. So they find it deeply fulfilling. At no point in time does anyone in the village ask the question, why are people floating down the river this way? What in the world is going on upstream that is continually creating some sort of carnage that floats by our village every morning when we wake up? And no one ever says, you know, it might be a good idea for us to get in the water and swim upstream or walk up the banks of the river in order to address the issue that keeps creating this sort of reality for the people in the water and sending them past our place on the riverbanks. Justice is the process of identifying and healing or revolutionizing systems that perpetuate suffering or death for others. It's the process of swimming upstream to unearth or identify power structures or ways of believing or thinking or feeling or legislating that create the downstream reality of suffering and death. Jesus knew what it was like to live in a world where things happened upstream in such a way that they impacted what was going on downstream where he lived. As a first century rabbi and carpenter, he had firsthand experience of what it meant to live under Roman occupation. He was born into a religious system that had lost its way, that was more concerned about preserving wealth and power and privilege at the expense of its own people. And he also knew what it was like to rescue the sick and dying. But he understood that the only way to revolutionize the thing that was creating the death and the carnage was to swim upstream, was to get to the starting point of where this was actually taking place. In fact, so much of what he was constantly talking about with his followers was the thing upstream. He would say things to his disciples, and then after his death and his resurrection and his departure, all these letters started to be written between his disciples and between these communities that were talking about the thing. It's not the only thing they talked about, but it was a lot of what they talked about. And they would talk about things like the powers and the principalities and the princes of this world and dominions. And they would do this as a way of naming the political and the religious system that continued to produce suffering and pain. In fact, let me just show you just like 3 of these exchanges. And they're sort of like these sound bites that have some of this terminology in them. And for the record, when I was a kid growing up, and even as an adult, I was told these terms were literal references to a literal sort of satanic personality that you read about or that surfaces in the scriptures. I was told these terms refer to the same, quote, Satan that was the serpent that tempted Adam and Eve, and it's the same Satan that was in competition with God for the soul of Job, or the same figure, the adversary that was tempting Jesus in the wilderness. And then when I was in 7th grade, I watched The Exorcist, and it was like, this crap's real. Maybe for you, it was The Conjuring when you were growing up, depending on what generation you emerged from. But what I want to do was, instead of thinking like Al Pacino in Devil's Advocate, like think really subversive, politically charged types of storytelling. Maybe if you're familiar with Banksy, the artist, think Banksy, like Banksy on steroids. If Banksy lived in the 1st century, was attempting to undermine the Caesars and the Herods rather, and the corrupt religious leaders of his day, and being Banksy could get you killed. Like, look at it through that set of glasses, because if you do, these statements read much differently. And so, for instance, in John's Gospel, chapter 12, verse 31, Jesus says something on the tail end of naming what's about to happen to himself. He knows he's going to die. He knows he's going to get arrested. He senses it. But he's holding out hope that this intersection, this moment where his death like blows the cover off of the scandal, like that might actually happen. And that everything will get exposed so that people will literally be able to go, oh, upstream, this is really the source of the problem. We can't keep turning a blind eye to it. And so he says, now judgment is upon this world. Now the prince of this world will be cast out. Paul writing to Corinthian Christians under Roman occupation and oppression who are envisioning the return of Christ as, again, this moment where the divine intersects reality, or Jesus is the culminating point for things being made right systematically. It says, then the end will come, and when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. Those words again. Paul again writing to Christians being oppressed in the city of Ephesus. Jesus' purpose was that now, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and the authorities in the heavenly realms. Again, you can read this as like people talking about some sort of satanic figure and some sort of army that's made up of demonic angels, but it makes more sense that something else subversive is happening here. It makes more sense that this would be coded language identifying the thing that's upstream. And all that to say that if that's true, it would also make sense that when Jesus turns to this rich young ruler and says, sell all your possessions, give the money to the poor, he's inviting this rich young ruler into solidarity. But then when he says, follow me, he's saying, I'm going upstream. Who's in? Who wants to go? Who will come after me? Who will make the trek along the shoreline or up the river in the water? Who's willing to live or, if necessary, die so that the river is healed? And so when you marry those two metaphors together that we've talked about over the last 2 weekends, in some instance, he's saying, listen, jump into the pool of solidarity and swim upstream towards justice. I think it was maybe, 10 years ago that we were introduced to a book called Everything Must Change by Brian McLaren. And it was this really hard piece to read, and when I mean hard, and not just like technically, but like the message it was communicating was hard to really hear. It was really insightful, but the whole book was about how entangled and how reliant or addicted the broken systems of this world really are on one another. If you can envision like a baseball that gets the cover knocked off of it and all the twine, like in some ways that's the way the systematic brokenness of this world looks. It's all entangled, and to try to dismantle that is delicate, painful, in some ways what feels like impossible work, and hence everything must change. And so that being said, there's a conversation about justice here that Watershed recognizes looks like this tangled mess. But then there's solidarity, and the two are deeply intertwined, and maybe in a moment you'll see how that is true. But can I spend a few moments just peeling back the layer a little bit more on solidarity? I know I spent some time doing that, but I think it'll lead us to where we need to go by the end of this morning. So if you are a person at some level who has the experience of being out of the pool in some place of privilege or power, and you want to be in solidarity, you want to at least try to start the first part of the journey that Jesus invites, there's a couple of things my experience has taught me that might be helpful to hear. One is you'll have to unlearn conditioned responses to your own biases. That's been my experience. If you're an out of the pool person, we have a lifetime of being blind to the way that we see or experience the people that are in the pool. Like there's a certain way that we think we understand them or make sense of them. And it's a bias that's not only a bias, but it's actually a socially validated bias as well. Like, so your relationships that you've been a part of for, in some instances, your whole life have taught you this at some level, and then they've also reinforced it, and you've done that for other people. And so no matter how much you think you are free of some of these ways of thinking, you really aren't. They're deeply embedded. No matter how awake you think you are, you're not as awake as you think. No matter how much you're convinced your vocabulary or your humor is free of these biases, it's not as much as you think. No matter how much you think you know what's appropriate or what's not appropriate, you're not as awake as you think. And it's kind of irrational to think you would be. In a very practical way, you're talking about ways of seeing, ways of thinking that have been created over the course of a lifetime. Like your neural pathways have been like going through the process of being what they are since you were most likely a child. And so to think that your thinking that's taken a lifetime to shape can change overnight, it's irrational on a good day. And so I say all that to say if you get into the pool, just get ready to fail. Like, get ready to be exposed for the biases that you think you've already overcome. Your ignorance, your blindness will get named. Firsthand experience with that. It will happen. Hopefully, it'll happen with someone who might be gentle in the way that they correct you. But the worst thing you can do if you start to feel the weight of being corrected and being called out by people that you said you wanted to be in solidarity with, the worst thing you could do would be to play like the victim card, because you're not the victim, all right? You're not the one that's in the pool. But because it's so, there's a degree of pain, it will be easy to go down that road. I was recently having this conversation with my 19-year-old daughter, who's obviously a woman, but who is also adopted from India. And so she's also a minority. And she has firsthand experiences already at 19 in our neighborhood where we live of being in the pool. And so I was kind of asking her about this and asking, I'm kind of like, this has been kind of hard. And, her first response was, I'm so sorry. Now you know what it's like to be me, a minority and a woman. And she said, I said, well, what should be my first response? And, the wisdom of a 19-year-old, she says, I suggest maybe some humility and some teachability could be the first response, maybe. And I said, you're grounded. No. I'm like, geez. She didn't learn that from me. She learned that from some of her mentors here in this community, and some of the mentors in her life are helping navigate what it's like to be in the pool. But if you're the person outside of the pool, you'll have to unlearn these preconditioned responses to your own biases. And can I suggest that your first response is humility and teachability? That's how you begin to put down the cup. Also, if you're a person outside the pool, my experience has been that the more that you move towards solidarity with people in the pool, the more distance and opposition you experience from people whose views you've once shared. The people that are still on the edge. They're still holding the cup. Outside the pool, there are these ways of believing and behaving that not only push people in the pool, but keep them there, that you were once blind to. And that blindness still exists. And ironically, these same ways of believing and behaving that used to be blind to, they also served as like this social glue. And you probably didn't realize it, but the social glue between you and the people who were left standing on the edge of the pool when you decided to get in. When you and I put down our cups and we get into the pool, essentially we're practicing a type of resistance that often creates some form of relational conflict or pressure. At the very least, it makes for really awkward Thanksgiving meal talk or emails. And at worst, it might produce some sort of rejection or exclusion or wounds. Jesus likened it to the experience of family members hating each other, which I think is almost irrelevant way of describing it today. But in his world, things were so intense. There was so much violence and death. He literally said, if you take me seriously and you start swimming upstream, it will get really ugly to the extent that you might have to choose between acceptance from your family or doing what you know deep down is the right thing to do. Another way of saying this could be the more you move towards solidarity, the more relational tension you are forced to hold between the people that probably you have loved or been loved by your whole life. And so, for instance, you might have to hold tension between truth-telling and boundary setting. You might have to figure out how to weather attacks and offer grace. You might have to figure out how to hold the tension between protecting yourself and practicing scandalous amounts of mercy or forgiveness. All the while remembering that you're in the pool with people who have gone through torturous things in their life. By the way, holding this type of tension, ironically, is really a part of the work that you're invited to do, which is another experience that I've learned. Like, the job of the person outside of the pool is actually to inspire or challenge people to drop their cups and jump in. That's our job. I used to think it was our job to get people out of the pool, which is a place of privilege and power. Like that's how someone with privilege and power thinks. Well, let me rescue you. Let me be the Messiah in all of this. The difference is that this isn't about rescuing people out of the pool, though. The whole journey is about revolutionizing what it means to have pool parties to begin with. It's about swimming upstream. But what I can do and what you can do, if we're the person holding the cup, is that we can use the leverage of our privilege for the purpose of getting fellow privileged friends to jump into the pool with us. And often I think it's the life or the voice of a person who has defected from the side of the pool that creates enough disruption for the people that's been left behind for them to push pause and go, wait a minute. Like, so Matt jumped into the pool, or this person jumped into the pool. Maybe there's something that I need to be thinking about differently. And it almost serves as sort of this micro to macro fracturing of a person as they watch what you're doing in your life. And so the way you hold tension might actually allow somebody to become free of their blindness in ways that you became free. And probably there was someone who did that for you to begin with. And so some of the best work might be you helping someone see and experience what you saw and are experiencing. And who knows, maybe someone might decide to get a little drenched. The job for the outside of the pool people is to inspire and challenge more outside of the pool people to jump in, to drop their cups. And then finally this, if solidarity and justice were a mountain, they would be Mount Everest. You are going to be drunk with metaphors after this morning, aren't you? You will be at a restaurant after this, and the waitress will say, can I take your order? And you'll be like, you mean like literally or like figuratively? Like, are you saying, what's going on here? And he or she'll just smile and go, oh, geez, why do Watershed people come here? If solidarity and justice were a mountain, they would be Mount Everest. There's really, as I understand it, I've never tried to climb Mount Everest. I think Scott has actually trekked the base of Mount Everest. You can check with him on that. But as I understand it, the oversimplified version is there's two parts of the journey. There's the trekking of the base of Mount Everest, and then once you reach a certain point, you start to ascend up to the summit. You trek the summit. And so there's the base and there's the summit. And a lot of people trek the base. It's relatively safe to do so, but very few people attempt to scale the summit. And those who do sometimes don't come home. In fact, there's 200 plus frozen remains of people that dot the mountainside as a reminder that you could literally lose your life trying to do this. And in some ways, solidarity is like trekking the base of Mount Everest, and justice is the summit. If you were to ask, well, where is Watershed on the mountain? I think if I were really honest with myself, I would say we're still trekking the base with our eyes on the summit, which is why Catapult is so important around here, you guys. It's why it's so significant. Catapult is our justice initiative. We continue to call it our justice initiative, not our solidarity initiative, because we want to keep our eyes on the summit. But it's our justice initiative that says is about empowering the youth of our city who have the least access to opportunity. As a church attempting to put down our red Solo cup, one of the things we've learned from and heard from the people in the pool here in Charlotte is our children need access to the same opportunities that exist for kids who stand outside of the pool. And so if you're really serious about solidarity, about standing with us, then bridge the gap. Help us bridge the gap between inopportunity and opportunity. Create mentoring and tutoring relationships between adults and our children as a way of providing more opportunities educationally, socially, and relationally for our kids. And that's a wildly oversimplified explanation of Catapult. But we're longing for 100 of these to be realized, 100 relationships between now and the end of next year. And you might be asking, well, what's the significance of 100 kids? Well, because every Sunday when we walk out of these doors, we have about 100 kids of our own that we care about. And I think Jesus had something to say about loving your neighbors yourself. And so if we're going to care for our own kids, maybe it would be wise as a starting point to do for others what we're already willing to do for ourselves. In the meantime, we continue to trek the base, keeping our eyes on the summit. I don't know how to get to the summit. I don't. Like, there's powerful work that gets done. There's powerful work that hopefully we can join in the weeks and the years and the months ahead. But what I do know is in the process of moving towards solidarity, in the process of getting in the pool, there's some really powerful redemptive work that we get to do. And so it's redemptive when people put down their red Solo cups and get in. That's redemptive. Working towards a watershed that is more diverse, that's even more inclusive, that's redemptive work. Children, both here in Charlotte and abroad, whether it's in our city or Guatemala or Africa or India, having access to opportunities in ways they've never known, that's redemptive work. I ran across this quote from Martin Luther King over the last week or so. Right before his death, he said, "I do get excited and I get a motive when I see it happening. When I see critical masses of people or courageous individuals step forward and do powerful work in revolutionizing the system." And it's like you can hear the language of critical mass as this idea of solidarity, generating courage and activism that has people jumping into waters and scaling summits. And so Watershed, as a church, may we continue to live well as we trek the base. May we put down our red Solo cups. May we do work that's redemptive. And may this inspire ourselves. May it inspire courage. May it invite other people into the pool. May it activate us further and further up the mountain, scaling towards the summit. May it fuel us to love and to live, and if necessary, die in the way we follow Jesus upstream. May this be our prayer, and may this be our story in the weeks, the months, and the decades to come. God, that seems like a Mount Everest thing that I just said, because it is. We have so much that we are addicted to that we would have to overcome just to move a notch up the mountainside. God, will you rip the things from our hands that keep us from becoming the people you long us to be, so that the world can be a place that doesn't just work for a few people, but actually works for everyone. We love you, God. Amen.